A young woman spends all of her money to help an elderly man who has gotten lost on the street. However, this act of kindness opens a door to a secret that will change her life completely. The deep gratitude a CEO feels for her unexpectedly transforms both of their lives. So, how will this generosity create a bond between two strangers? How does fate shape itself through a simple act of kindness? Clara, 25 years old, was a young woman with long brown hair and deep, soulful brown eyes that gave off a sense of calm and trust to those around her. Life hadn't been easy for her. She had been trying to stand on her own feet in a big city, but sometimes the struggle wore her down. Coming from a difficult family background, Clara had learned to be self-sufficient from an early age. She had tried to trust her loved ones, but more often than not, she ended up disappointed. That's why she chose to stay strong and move forward without depending on others. After graduating from college, she realized that finding a job wasn't as easy as she had imagined. She applied to many places to start the career she dreamed of, constantly preparing for interviews, but she could never seem to catch the right opportunity. During this process, she worked part-time at a small, cozy cafe to make ends meet. During the busy hours, she made coffee, took orders, smiled at customers, and sometimes listened in on their brief conversations. But deep down, she was getting tired of this monotonous pace. As the days passed, she felt like her life was stuck in a cycle. That day started just like any other. She was serving customers who walked in through the cafe door, taking orders, and drifting into her thoughts. Then, she noticed an elderly man slowly approaching the counter. The man wore an old, faded jacket that showed the marks of time. His face was tired, covered in deep wrinkles, and there was something hidden in his eyes, maybe the weight of the years, or perhaps a sadness he carried inside. "Excuse me," he said, his voice shaky and tired. "Can I use your phone? I need to make an important call." When Clara saw the man's embarrassed gaze, she didn't hesitate for a second. She quietly nodded, pulled out her phone from her pocket, and handed it to him. The man smiled faintly, grateful for the kind gesture. With trembling hands, he dialed a number, but a few seconds later, a shadow crossed his face. Clara heard him let out a deep sigh in the silence that followed the phone's ringing. "Oh no," he whispered, his voice full of frustration. Then he dialed another number, but again, the result was the same. At that moment, he lowered his eyes, as if there was a void inside him. When Clara saw the expression on his face, something stirred inside her. Something wasn't right, that much was clear. But she didn't know what the old man was after. He took a deep breath, hung up the phone, and handed it back to Clara. "Thank you," he said softly, but his voice seemed broken. Clara felt the weight behind that simple but meaningful thank you. There was something in the man's eyes: loneliness, regret, or perhaps loss. Clara, unaware of it, felt herself drawn inward. At that moment, she wondered what this stranger's story was. How could someone look so tired and broken? And maybe, most importantly, could she help him? Did something happen? Clara asked gently. Her voice was soft, but it carried a genuine concern. The man nodded slightly, his eyes starting to fill with tears. His lips trembled, and his face, covered with deep lines, showed the marks of the weight he carried inside. "I live in a small town," he began, his voice tired but trembling. "I came to visit my son. I fell asleep on the train. When I woke up, my phone and wallet were gone." His voice grew weaker with each word, as if even saying these sentences was difficult for him. His gaze drifted to the floor, as if he was hoping to find his lost items there instead of speaking. He paused for a moment, cleared his throat, and then added in a quieter voice, "I had memorized my son's number, but I can't remember it properly. It's just old age." He took a deep breath, briefly lifted his eyes to Clara, but in that glance, there was not only fatigue, but a kind of disappointment, as if towards himself, his memory, and the inevitable forgetfulness that came with age. Clara's heart squeezed. The man's helplessness reminded her of a lost child scared, not knowing what to do, searching for a way. But this man wasn't a child, he was someone who had carried the weight of the years, yet at that moment, he looked as defenseless as a child. She didn't want to leave him like this. A strong desire to help this stranger rose inside her. "Maybe we can do something," she said gently but firmly. She smiled slightly, as if to reassure him. "If you tell me a bit more, maybe we can find a clue. You remember your son's name, right? Or anything about where he lives?" The elderly man blinked, as if trying to search his memory for something. Clara thought that perhaps he hadn't just lost his belongings, but maybe more his hope, perhaps the bond he was trying to form with his son, or just the feeling of still being strong. But something was missing from this story. And Clara was determined to figure it out. The man seemed to be touched by Clara's genuine concern. A faint smile appeared on his tired face, and a sense of relief mixed with gratitude appeared in his eyes. He nodded slightly and said, "My name is Albert," his voice still a little shaky, but warmer now. "My son's name is Alexander. I think he works somewhere in the city center, but I'm not sure exactly where." Clara couldn't ignore the uncertainty in the elderly man's voice. She wanted to help him, but there was a problem: her shift had just started, and she couldn't risk her job. Her boss was quite grumpy, and asking for time off during the busiest hours could cause a big issue. She took a deep breath, gently touched the sleeve of the man's slightly crumpled jacket, and smiled understandingly as she explained the situation. "I can't leave right now," she said in a soft but firm voice. "That man over there is my boss, and he doesn't like it when I ask for time off during busy hours. But I promise, my shift only lasts for 2 more hours. If you can wait, we can find Alexander together. Don't worry, I'm here." Albert paused for a moment, looking into Clara's eyes. Then, with a slight nod, the tension in his eyes seemed to ease a bit. "All right," he murmured. He took a deep breath, as if realizing that someone was actually going to help him. Clara nodded with a reassuring smile. "Now, I need to ask something small from you," she said cheerfully but carefully. "I just want you to act like a regular customer. No one should suspect anything during these 2 hours. Sit at a table, and if anyone asks, you're just here for coffee. You can order anything you want, on me." Albert blinked, then the corners of his lips lifted slightly. "All right, let's do it," he said, smiling faintly. Clara was happy to see him relax a bit. But deep down, she still felt there was something in this old man's story that needed to be solved. Finding his son, did it just mean connecting him with someone, or was there something much deeper, much more emotional going on? For now, the only thing she could do was wait for her shift to end. But 2 hours later, she would do everything she could to find a solution to this man's loneliness. Albert silently sat at a table. His tired body sank into the chair, as if he hadn't sat down and rested like this in a long time. Clara grabbed her tray and, approaching him as if she were going to take his order like she did with other customers, asked, "What would you like?" The man lifted his head slightly, took a deep, thoughtful breath, and gently replied, "Just a glass of water." Clara's heart ached. A voice inside her whispered that this sentence was said to avoid hunger. She knew the man didn't have money in his pocket, and he probably hadn't eaten for a long time. Who knew how many hours, maybe since the morning, had passed without food? She thought. Without hesitation, she headed to the kitchen. She quickly had something prepared, a nourishing, filling plate. As she placed the food on the tray, her eyes lingered on the elderly man at the table. Albert's shoulders were slightly slumped, tired but still calm. It might have been strange to worry about a stranger, but Clara felt uneasy seeing this man sitting there like that. Slowly, she picked up the tray, returned to the table, and placed the plate in front of him. Albert's eyes widened in surprise. He looked at the food, then back at Clara, and then at the food again. He gripped the edge of the table, clearly unsure of what to say. "I don't have money to pay for this," he whispered, his voice filled with shame. Clara leaned in slightly, speaking softly as if sharing a secret. "You're not paying for it. It's on me," she said with a sweet smile. "Let's keep this between us, okay?" The weariness in Albert's eyes briefly faded, replaced with a hint of light. His lips curved upward, maybe for the first time in days, into a small smile. But the gratitude in his eyes was more real than anything. He nodded slightly, offering a silent thank you. Clara noticed Albert's hand trembling as he reached for his fork. For a moment, all the tension had disappeared, as if the weight of the years had lifted just a little. Sharing that moment sparked a warm feeling inside Clara, a kind of deep, unexplainable peace. How interesting, she thought, the older we get, the more the child within us begins to emerge. Albert carefully took his first bite, his eyes closing for a brief moment. Clara saw how a small act of kindness could give someone a moment of hope, even if just for an instant. And perhaps, for him, that was worth more than anything. When the meal was finished, the man thanked Clara with a warm smile. Clara silently handed him a coffee and placed the money in the cash register without writing a bill. Albert noticed this subtle gesture but said nothing. At the end of her shift, Clara saw the man waiting by the corner as she stepped out of the cafe. As she walked toward him, Albert smiled faintly and said, "See? Nobody noticed anything." Clara laughed. "You have a natural talent," she teased. Looking at her with gratitude, Albert replied, "Thank you for the meal and coffee. When I find my son, I'll pay you back for everything, and don't you dare refuse," he said, wagging his finger playfully. Clara smiled. "First, let's find your son, and then we'll think about that," she replied, gently looping her arm through his as they began to walk together. They walked in silence for a while. Clara felt a strange sense of peace inside. The man's fears, her own daily worries, everything seemed to lighten for just a moment. "Do you know what kind of place Alexander works at?" Clara asked. The man hesitated, looked away, then, a bit embarrassed, said, "It's a big place, I think that's all I know." Clara furrowed her brow. The man's memory seemed foggy, or maybe he was just too tense. He sighed lightly, as if he felt inadequate himself. Clara took a deep breath and continued. "Okay, what did he say on the phone? Where were you supposed to meet?" The man lowered his head, his voice almost turning into a whisper. "He told me to call him when I got off the train and to wait for him there, but I couldn't call him. I waited at the train station for hours, but I couldn't find him. Then I started walking and came to the cafe." Clara furrowed her brow, trying to make sense of what she had heard. This is almost impossible, she thought. His son had told him to wait here, but hours had passed and no one had shown up. There was something off about this. She paused for a moment, then asked with renewed hope, "Had you been here before?" Albert's eyes slightly brightened, as if Clara's question had reminded him of something. "Yes," he nodded. "I've been to his place a few times, but he always picked me up by car and drove me straight there." Clara quickly processed this information. "Okay, do you remember the surroundings? What was it like?" she asked again, more hopefully. The man furrowed his brow, struggling with his memory. He paused for a moment, then his eyes widened as if he had remembered something. "There was a burger joint across the street," he said slowly. "And a park. I could see kids playing from the balcony." Clara nodded instinctively, committing this new piece of information to memory. Finally, they had a clue. Clara and Albert wandered the streets for hours. They stopped in front of every burger joint, carefully read the signs, entered to ask customers and staff questions. But each time, Albert squinted at the surroundings, then shook his head lightly and said, "This isn't it." As Clara silently watched each new hope turn into disappointment, she pulled out her phone and began searching online for other nearby burger places. They checked every restaurant listed one by one. But as time passed, the list grew shorter, and eventually, there were no more places to check. The evening began to fall, and the streetlights lit up one by one. They were both tired, their feet growing heavy. After a long day, fatigue and disappointment weighed down on their shoulders. Finally, Albert stopped. He took a deep breath and then turned to Clara. His eyes were tired, and his voice carried a hint of helplessness. "I don't think we're going to find it like this," he said sadly. Clara lowered her head, feeling a tightness in her chest. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She really wanted to help him, but right now, her hands were empty. Albert sighed deeply, as if deciding to say something he had been holding in for a long time. "I have to ask," he said quietly, avoiding her gaze. "If you could buy me a train ticket, I could contact Alexander from there. I'll definitely pay you back." Clara looked at him anxiously. "Are you sure you can do this on your own?" she asked, doubt clear in her voice. Albert straightened a little, pulled his shoulders back. Despite his exhaustion, there was a clear determination in his eyes. "Definitely," he said confidently. "I just need to get on the train." Clara felt a sense of unease inside her. She didn't want Albert to make this journey on his own. She had seen how fragile and vulnerable he was throughout the day. She thought for a moment, then took a deep breath and made a firm decision. "All right," she said slowly. "You'll stay with me tonight. Tomorrow morning, we'll get you a train ticket. I'll give you my phone number, and you can call me when you get home." Albert nodded slightly but looked down at the ground with a sense of guilt. "I'm burdening you," he said apologetically. Clara smiled gently and wrapped her arm around his. "Don't be silly, you're practically my friend now," she said sincerely. "I actually had a lot of fun today," she added, winking. Albert looked at her in surprise at first, but then a small smile appeared on his face. The tension that had built up throughout the day slowly gave way to a bit of relief. They walked together toward the bus stop with slow steps. They didn't talk much along the way, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if they had grown accustomed to each other. The stars began to appear in the sky, and a light breeze blew. As Clara walked beside the old man, despite the day's fatigue, she felt a sense of peace within her. Albert, perhaps for the first time in a long while, accompanied her with a feeling of trust he hadn't felt in years. This night would mark the end of a long day for both of them. But maybe, it was also the beginning of something new. Clara, Albert I Evine Goturdu. Ice ride, Albert sesses Clarinine Yasadajai Kukuk Derai Insolidi. Der Kukuk, Sod v Mutavazidi, Enkak Albert, Clarinine Hayatindaki Mukadelerin Yuzai Yansadigini Gorbaliordu. Yinda, Onan Misafer Perverlagi ve Bur Yabansia Yardim Etmi Kanasundaki Karalilajai, Onan Yuklarindan Basilarini Hafalet Misti. Jorgen Lugina Ragman, Clara Nadir Gorlan Bur Memmuniat Duigusu Hisedi Yordu. Kukuk Bur Nezikat Ilamai, Iki Yabansi Arasinda Bur Bag Olastermis ve Ikasim de Insan Beglantasanin Gukunu Haderlet Misti. Artisi Sabah Clara Mutfaktan Gelen Hafif Seslo Yandi. Yataktan Kokti, Esnadi ve Oterma Odasana Yurudu, Albert in Metfakta Bur Siler Hazarladigini Goran Sisurdi. Ganadan, Dedi, Sesi Hala Waikaluidu. Albert Gulum Sidi v. Ganadan, Clara, Ama Sana Soilamelium Ki, Pek Siglikli Beslameyerson, Dedi. Clara Hafifs Kikardadi, Goslarini Ovasturdu. Sok Fazla Zamanim Yak, Di Sevapladi. Albert, Claria Hayatila Iljalai Burkak Soru Sordu v. Clara Mukadelarini v. Zorluklarini Pilasti. Albert Herkelomile Daha de Umasadi. Clarinine Karsalastagi Zorlukler Onu Derindan et Kilamisti, Enkak Onu en Sak et Kilian se her Seye Ragman Gosterdigi de Niklolikti. Clara Natsik, Guklu v. Bagam Sizdigersektan Sira Daisai Bur Jank Kadindi. Kavaltadan Sanra Ikisi de Odibus Durajana Dogri Yola Koyoljalar. Albert Odibus Binerkan Clarinine Kaluna Titundu. Sihir Gasurkan Pensariden Desari Bakti, Ama Ani Dan Yuzu Hikanla Aiden Landi. Clara, ist o park, die Hakerti, Pensarinen Decini Iseret Ederek. Clara Heman onen Iseret Edigi yon Bakti ve Heman Bursen Rocky Durak Isen Dugmai Busti. Sakin ol, Dedi, Otobus Yavaslarkin Albert I Sakin Tutmea Kalisarak. Otobustin in Dikorind Clara Parki Tarati v Saskin Likla, Barada Hamburgersi Yak, Dedi. Albert Goslarini Kizarak Kadan in Karsasindaki Bur Restaurani Iseret Edi. Digismus al Mali, Eskiden Hamburger Sidi. Clara and Laisla Bassini Salati. Mantikli, Di Miral Dandi. Albert Uzan Zamandir Buraya Jelmadigini Fark Edi. As they approached the apartment building and reached the entrance, Clara checked the doorbell and glanced at the list of names. After a few seconds, the name Alexander Clark caught her attention. She frowned as she tried to recall where she had seen the name before. Albert rang the doorbell, and the door opened immediately. As they walked inside, Clara still wondered where she had encountered that name. When they entered the elevator, Clara tried to piece things together in her mind. As the elevator doors opened, they found a man standing in front of them, wearing casual clothes with a worried yet relieved expression on his face. Alexander, Albert said excitedly. His son quickly embraced him. Dad, I'm so glad I found you, don't worry, you're safe now, he reassured him soothingly. Watching their reunion, Clara suddenly remembered. She had seen Alexander Clark before at the cafe. He was the manager of a well-known women's fashion brand, and Clara had seen him several times on the cafe's customer list. The other staff, especially the waiters, would always whisper about him, calling him Mr. Clark. Everyone liked him, handsome, successful, and a bit mysterious, always attracting the attention of those around him. Now, here he was, standing with his father at his home. Albert quickly introduced Clara to Alexander. This young lady didn't just look after me, she offered me a place to stay and helped me when I had no one, he said gratefully. We owe you so much. Clara, a little embarrassed, replied humbly, please, anyone would have done the same. When Alexander learned how anxious his father had been the entire night, trying to find him, he looked at Clara with sincere thanks. Thank you for everything, please come in, let's have a coffee, he said, extending his hand toward the door. Clara, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness, glanced at her watch and with a small apology, said, I'd love to, but I really have to get to work. But it was wonderful meeting you. You have my number, don't hesitate to reach out if you want to help me again with a mission like this, she added, winking. Albert smiled faintly and his eyes welled up a bit. Thank you, Clara. At least let us cover your expenses, he offered sincerely. But Clara shook her head with a smile, really, there's no need, take care of yourselves, she said, pressing the elevator button and waving one last time. Alexander and Albert stood at the end of the hallway, watching her with admiration. A few days later, while Clara was working, Alexander entered the cafe and surprised her. The other employees immediately started whispering. Hello, Clara, he said with a smile. I just wanted to thank you again for helping my father. Clara, trying to act as if it were nothing, replied, it's no big deal, but her face turned red. Alexander paused for a moment, then continued, I want to thank you properly, so I'd like to invite you to dinner. Clara widened her eyes in surprise, but in response to Alexander's kind and sincere gaze, she unexpectedly found herself moving closer to him. I'd like that, she said, her heart racing. During dinner that evening, Clara realized that helping Albert wasn't just about reuniting a father and son, it had also given her the chance to open a new chapter in her own life. When the dinner ended, Alexander hesitated for a moment and then looked directly at Clara. You know, he said thoughtfully, my dad has talked so much about you, how kind you are, how resourceful you are, how you were there for him during his hardest times, and how you never let him feel like a burden. He said he looks to you as an example of who he wants to be. Clara blushed slightly from the compliment and nervously traced her finger around the edge of her glass. That's really sweet, your dad is an amazing person, she said. Alexander smiled. No, Clara, most people wouldn't do what you did. Really, after everything, I couldn't stop thinking about you. I want to get to know you better. Clara looked at him in surprise, but his words were sincere and warm. My dad is already making plans to visit you. He talks about how much he loves that town, and I think he's right, he added. What do you think? Maybe one day you could go see it. Clara smiled gently, her heart lightened. I'd like that, she said. And as they stepped into the cool evening air, Clara realized that this wasn't just a dinner, it was the beginning of something far more meaningful for both of them. Sometimes, a small act of kindness leads to the most unexpected and beautiful results. If this story inspires you and warms your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more. Every week, we'll be bringing you life-changing stories. Your support means the world to us.